The autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of the small brick house on Maple Street in Portland, Oregon, the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to soak into your bones. Margaret Hollis sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in November 2001, nursing a cold cup of coffee, staring at the photograph she'd kept on her nightstand for 12 years. Her husband, David, smiled back at her from that Thanksgiving photo taken in 1989, his arm around their son, Tommy, who was just 7 years old then, his gap-toothed grin capturing a moment before everything fell apart. Margaret's hands trembled as she set the picture down. It was November 2001, and life had taught her that some wounds never truly close. They only learn to hide. David had vanished on a Tuesday in March 1989, walking out to pick up milk from the corner store and never coming back. The police searched for weeks. They dragged the Willamette River, their boats moving slowly through the dark water like insects on oil. They questioned his co-workers at the architecture firm downtown, asking about his state of mind, whether he'd seemed depressed or unstable. They spoke to his friends from college, his estranged brother in California, even his childhood best friend who'd moved to Seattle. But David Hollis had simply evaporated, leaving behind a wife, a young son, and a mystery that consumed their lives like a slow-burning fire that never quite went out. Margaret had aged a decade in those 12 years. Her blonde hair was now streaked with silver, her face lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from hope deferred indefinitely. She'd spent the first 5 years checking the faces of every man who passed on the street, her heart leaping and plummeting 1,000 times. She'd attended meetings of missing persons' families, listened to other stories equally devastating, equally unresolved. She'd hired private investigators twice, spending money they didn't have, following leads that went nowhere. The second investigator had gently suggested that David was probably dead, that sometimes closure meant accepting that some questions would never have answers. Tommy was 19 now, a sophomore at the University of Oregon studying engineering. He rarely spoke about his father, and Margaret had learned not to push. Grief was a private thing, especially for men, she'd come to believe. She'd dated occasionally over the years, a divorced accountant named Robert, who'd lasted 6 months, a kind lawyer named James who'd wanted to marry her, but nothing serious. She was unable to fully commit to anyone while David's ghost still occupied space in her heart and home, taking up room that another living person deserved. She'd decorated the house the way David had liked it, preserved his study with his books and blueprints still on the shelves. She'd kept his wedding ring in her nightstand drawer. She'd never filed for divorce because, in some illogical part of her heart, she still felt married to a man who might walk through the door at any moment. The grief counselor she'd seen years ago had called this suspended animation, living in a state between hope and despair, unable to truly move forward because moving forward felt like betrayal. The phone call came on a rainy November evening, just as Margaret was preparing dinner. She was chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, listening to the local news on the small television in the corner of the kitchen. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, measured, and utterly impossible. "Margaret, it's David." Her hand went numb. The knife clattered to the cutting board. The receiver nearly slipped from her fingers. For a long moment she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "I'm sorry. Who is this?" she finally managed, though some part of her already knew. "It's me. It's really me. I know this is going to sound insane, but I'm alive. I'm in Denver. I've been in Denver for 12 years. I know I have no right to call, no right to ask for anything, but I need to see you and Tommy. I need to explain everything." Margaret's first instinct was that this was some kind of cruel hoax, a sick person with too much time on their hands. She'd received crank calls before over the years, people claiming to have seen David, people claiming to be David. But something in that voice stopped her from hanging up. There was a hesitation she remembered, a particular cadence to how he pronounced her name. Not Margaret like most people, but Margaret, with the stress on the second syllable. Only David had ever said it that way. "How do I know this is real?" she whispered. "The scar on my left shoulder," he said immediately. "I got it when I fell off your brother's roof in 1985 while helping Vincent renovate his garage. You kissed it every night for a week after it healed. You said it looked like a crescent moon." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her. That detail wasn't in any missing persons report, wasn't something a stranger would know. He continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Our first date was at Stefano's on Morrison Street. You ordered the seafood pasta and got sauce all over your white blouse. I thought it was the most endearing thing I'd ever seen. We went back to your apartment and you changed into one of my shirts because your blouse was ruined." Tears were streaming down her face now. "Why?" she breathed. "Why now? Where have you been?" "I can't explain over the phone," he said. "But I'm real, Margaret. I've been alive all this time. I'm coming to Portland. I'll be there in 3 days. Please don't tell Tommy yet. Please, just let me come home. If you're watching this story right now, I need you to do something for us. Subscribe to this channel. It only takes 1 click. And leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Are you from the United States? Which state? Your comments help us so much, and they help our community grow. Now, let's continue with this incredible mystery. Part 2. Tommy was 19 and carried his father's absence like a physical weight. He was tall, like David had been, with the same lean build and dark hair, but he'd inherited his mother's eyes, that pale grey that seemed to see through pretense and dishonesty. He rarely spoke about his father, and Margaret had learned not to push the subject. Grief was a private thing, especially for men. That's what everyone told her anyway, and she'd come to believe it because it was easier than facing the possibility that Tommy's silence was something deeper. Anger, perhaps, or betrayal at being abandoned. Tommy had been 7 when his father disappeared, old enough to have memories, but young enough that they'd become fragmented and dreamlike over time. He remembered his father's laugh, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from his chest. He remembered sitting on his shoulders at the Oregon Zoo, his small hands gripping David's thick, dark hair. He remembered his father building a treehouse in the backyard, remembered the smell of fresh-cut wood and his father's cologne mixing together. But these memories had become unreliable over 12 years, worn smooth like stones in a river, their edges softened by time and doubt. The Monday before David called, Tommy had come home from Eugene for a few days. He'd been stressed about his engineering coursework, worried about his GPA. He and Margaret had eaten dinner together, and she'd noticed how tired he looked, how much older he seemed than 19. He'd mentioned a girl named Lauren from his physics class, someone he liked but was too nervous to ask out. Margaret had smiled and told him he had his father's charm, and Tommy had stiffened slightly at the mention of David. "I don't really remember him," Tommy had said, and there was something defensive in his tone. "He's been gone most of my life. I'm not sure I have his anything." Now, 2 days after David's phone call, Margaret sat across from her son in the living room of their Portland home. Tommy was stretched out on the couch, absently flipping through a magazine, while Margaret struggled with whether to tell him. The secret sat heavy in her chest, a weight she couldn't bear alone but felt terrified to share. What if it was a hoax? What if it wasn't David at all, just some con artist who'd researched her family and constructed an elaborate deception? Or worse, what if it really was David and Tommy rejected him outright? She'd protected her son from hope for so long because she knew the price of disappointed hope. "Tommy, I need to tell you something," Margaret finally said. He looked up from his magazine, sensing the gravity in her voice. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. It's just, I received a phone call yesterday. It was—" She paused, trying to find the words. "It was someone who claims to be your father." Tommy's entire body went rigid. The magazine fell from his hands. "That's not funny, Mum. I know it sounds impossible. I know it sounds insane, but he knew things, Tommy. Things that only your father would know. Personal details. He said he's been living in Denver for the past 12 years. He said he's coming to Portland. He's arriving tomorrow." "It's a scam," Tommy said flatly. "Someone's trying to con you. Someone's seen those old missing person flyers or read something online and decided to take advantage of you." "I thought the same thing," Margaret admitted. "But his voice, Tommy, it sounded like him. It sounded exactly like him." "You were 7 years old when he left," Tommy said, his voice sharp. "You don't actually remember what his voice sounded like. You remember a version of it that you've constructed in your mind over 12 years. Anyone could manipulate you." Margaret flinched at the harsh truth in his words. He wasn't wrong. Memory was a strange thing, malleable and unreliable. She could have misremembered, could have projected onto a stranger's voice the qualities she wanted to hear. "He's bringing documentation," Margaret said. "And he's agreed to a DNA test. He said if I didn't believe him, we could verify it scientifically." Tommy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the November rain continued its relentless fall. "I don't want to see him," he said quietly. "Whether it's real or not, I don't want to see him." "I understand," Margaret said. "Do you?" Tommy turned to face her, and she could see tears in his eyes. "Because I don't think you do. For 12 years it was just us. We figured things out together. We got through everything without him. And now you want to just invite him back into our lives? What if he leaves again?" The question hung between them, the unspoken fear they'd both carried for over a decade. What if he came back, just to disappear again? "I need to know," Margaret said softly. "I need to know what happened to him. I need to know if he's alive, if he was looking for us, if he thought about us." "And what if the answer breaks your heart all over again?" Tommy asked. Margaret had no response to that. She knew he was right. She was about to open a door that might bring devastation, along with whatever truth waited on the other side. But she also knew she couldn't keep living in this suspended animation, this purgatory of not knowing. She'd spent 12 years waiting. She couldn't spend the rest of her life doing the same. The next day, Margaret picked up the man claiming to be David at the Portland International Airport. She recognized him immediately, or rather she recognized enough of him. His build was similar, his gait familiar, but 12 years had changed him. His hair was longer, darker than she remembered, with grey threading through it. His face was weathered, lined in ways that seemed beyond what 12 years should have done. He had a beard, something David had never worn. But when he looked at her, those hazel eyes, with the slight asymmetry she'd stared into on their wedding night, were unmistakably his. He looked like a ghost, or rather, like someone who'd spent 12 years being haunted. "Margaret," he said, and her heart broke and healed simultaneously at the sound of her name. She didn't embrace him. She wasn't sure if she had the right to anymore. Instead, they stood there in the airport terminal, separated by more than just physical distance, connected by a thread of 12 years and questions that demanded answers. "I don't know what to believe," Margaret said. "I know," he replied. "I don't deserve to be believed, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I am who I say I am." Part 3. The man they called David checked into a motel on the edge of Portland, a modest place called the Riverside Inn, with aging carpet and thin walls. He didn't try to stay at the house with Margaret and Tommy. He seemed to understand that trust was something that had to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, brick by brick. He spent his first week in Portland working temporary construction jobs through a day labor agency, the kind of work that paid cash and required no background checks. In the evenings, he'd sit in his motel room, room 247, a detail that seemed important for some reason, and try to construct a narrative that made sense, a story that could bridge 12 years of absence. On the third evening after his arrival, Margaret came to the motel and sat with him in his small room. There was a television playing quietly in the background, muted. 2 cups of coffee from a nearby diner sat on the nightstand between them. "Tell me everything," Margaret said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out." David took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from very far away. "Do you remember my brother Vincent?" he began. "Before everything with his wife came out, before I cut him off?" Margaret nodded. She remembered Vincent, a charming man who'd always seemed to be one step away from disaster. He'd borrowed money from David several times over the years, money that was never paid back. He'd been involved in some kind of real estate scheme that Margaret had never fully understood. David had warned her about his brother, had said that Vincent was charismatic but fundamentally dishonest. "The night I disappeared, I ran into him in the parking lot of the store," David continued. "I was just going to get milk, Margaret. That's all I was going to do. But Vincent was there, and he looked desperate in a way I'd never seen before. He told me he was in trouble, serious trouble. He'd borrowed money from some people, and not just any money. He'd borrowed from loan sharks, people who didn't appreciate being refused payment." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. "He asked me to hide him. He asked me to give him money and help him disappear. And I refused. I told him he needed to go to the police, that running would only make things worse. I told him he'd brought this on himself through his own stupidity and dishonesty." "That sounds like you," Margaret said quietly. "You were always so principled about things like that." "It was arrogance," David said bitterly. "That's what it was. I thought I was better than Vincent, that I'd made better choices. I thought I could lecture him about the consequences of his actions, and then he told me something that changed everything." He turned back to face her. "He told me that he'd been abusing his wife in Los Angeles. Not just once, Margaret. For years. He told me in this casual way, like it was just another problem he had, like it was something I should help him with, and I lost it. I told him I was going to contact the authorities. I told him that he needed to turn himself in, that he needed to face what he'd done." David sat back down on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands. "That's when he threatened you and Tommy," he continued, his voice muffled. "He said that if I involved the police, if I did anything to expose him, he'd find you both. He said he had connections, people who owed him favors, people who weren't afraid to hurt people, and I believed him. You have to understand, Margaret, I believed him completely. I thought he was capable of anything." "David," Margaret said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "He told me I had a choice," David said, looking up at her. "Either I disappeared, left town, left everything, left you and Tommy, or he'd come for my family. He said he'd give me 1 hour to decide. He said if I wasn't gone by then, he'd come to this house and take Tommy." Tears were streaming down David's face now. "I was terrified, Margaret. I was more terrified than I've ever been. Vincent wasn't a good man, but he was a desperate man, and desperate men do desperate things. I thought if I disappeared, if I got away from you both, then you'd be safe. I thought he'd have no reason to hurt you if I wasn't around." "So you just left?" Margaret asked, and there was pain in her voice, the pain of someone realizing that her husband had made a choice to abandon her, even if that choice was made out of fear. "I took a bus to Seattle that night," David said. "I didn't take anything except the clothes I was wearing. I didn't call. I didn't leave a note. I was afraid that Vincent would be watching the house, and I didn't want to draw his attention to you. From Seattle, I made my way to Denver. I worked construction jobs under an assumed name. I lived in cheap apartments. I worked long hours, so that I wouldn't have time to think about what I'd left behind. "Did you ever try to contact us?" Margaret asked. "Did you ever think about coming back?" "Every single day," David said. "Every single day for 12 years. But I was terrified. I was terrified of bringing danger back to you. And I was terrified of what I'd become. This stranger living under a false name, estranged from everyone I loved." David stood up again and walked to a small desk in the corner of the motel room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn piece of paper. He handed it to Margaret. It was a printed email, one of those old emails printed out from an internet cafe, the kind of thing people did before email became ubiquitous on phones. The date on the top was June 1989, just 3 months after David had disappeared. "I sent this to your parents' house," David said. "I addressed it to you, but I was afraid to sign my name. I was afraid that if anyone intercepted it, they'd be able to trace me. So I just signed it, your husband. I wanted you to know I was alive. I wanted you to know that I loved you." Margaret read the email with trembling hands. The words were almost unrecognizable, David's words, but filtered through fear and desperation. He talked about missing her, about thinking about Tommy every day, about the weight of his absence. He talked about his fear of Vincent, his terror at bringing violence to their door. "I only sent it once," David said quietly. "I was too afraid to send more. I was afraid that the police might trace it, that Vincent might somehow find out that I was communicating with you." "Did I ever receive it?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," David said. "My parents never mentioned it to me. I never got a response. Eventually, I stopped looking for ways to contact you. I stopped imagining ways that I could come back." "Why now?" Margaret asked, the question that had haunted her since his phone call. "Why come back now, after all this time?" "Because Vincent died," David said simply. "I found out through a lawyer who tracked me down in Denver. Apparently, Vincent died in a car accident in Reno last September. He hit a telephone pole head-on. The lawyer said Vincent had mentioned me in his will, had left me some money. It was a small amount, but the lawyer found me because of it." David looked directly at Margaret. "When I found out Vincent was dead, it was like a chain broke inside me. For 12 years, I'd carried his threats with me like a weight around my neck. And suddenly, that weight was gone. Suddenly, it occurred to me that I could come back, that I could try to rebuild what I'd destroyed." "What if Vincent was lying?" Margaret asked. "What if he never had these connections? What if you spent 12 years away for nothing?" "That's a question I've asked myself 1,000 times, David said, "and the answer doesn't matter anymore. Whether he was lying or telling the truth, I made my choice. I chose fear over faith. I chose running over fighting. That's something I have to live with." Part 4. Over the next 2 weeks, David slowly became part of Margaret and Tommy's life again. He didn't push for intimacy or forgiveness. He was careful, respectful, living at the motel, but spending his days helping Margaret with projects around the house, fixing the fence that had been broken for years, repainting the kitchen, repairs that David would have done if he'd never left. Tommy maintained his distance, but Margaret noticed small cracks forming in his resistance. One afternoon, Tommy came home from Eugene and found David in the garage, working on restoring an old bicycle that had belonged to Tommy when he was younger. The bicycle had been damaged years ago, and Tommy had abandoned it in the garage where it had gathered dust and rust. "What are you doing?" Tommy asked. "Trying to restore this," David said. "I thought maybe you'd like to have it in working condition again. I remember you loved this bike. You'd ride it up and down the street, and I'd follow you on foot to make sure you didn't fall." Tommy watched his father work, watched the careful way he handled the bicycle, the concentration on his face. Something shifted in Tommy's expression. Some hard barrier that had been holding back started to crack. "I don't ride bikes anymore," Tommy said, but he didn't leave. He stayed and watched, and eventually he pulled up a stool and started handing David tools, working alongside him. By Thanksgiving, a fragile peace had been established. David was invited to dinner at the house. Margaret cooked the turkey the way she always did, and David prepared the stuffing the way he used to, with oysters and fresh herbs. Tommy helped his father prepare the side dishes. For one evening, if you didn't look too closely at the strain around everyone's eyes, the house felt like it had before, like a family. "I want to be honest with you both," David said as they sat around the dinner table, "about what comes next. I want to rebuild my life here if you'll let me. I want to be part of your lives again, but I understand that trust isn't something that can be given instantly. I need to earn it, day by day, moment by moment. I'm going to find permanent work. I'm going to save money. I want to get a small place nearby, not too close, but close enough that we can see each other regularly. And whenever you feel ready, I want to take a DNA test. I want to put all of this beyond doubt." "That's probably a good idea," Tommy said quietly, and Margaret saw relief wash over David's face at the implicit acceptance. A week later, Tommy agreed to the DNA test. They went to a private lab in downtown Portland. The process was simple: a swab of the inside of each cheek, samples placed in containers, documentation filled out. The lab technician explained that results would take 2 weeks due to the thoroughness of their testing process. During those 2 weeks, David continued rebuilding his presence in their lives. He found a job at an architectural firm, a small firm, nothing like the prestigious place where he'd worked before, but honest work. He rented a small apartment 3 blocks away. He and Tommy started going to basketball games together, a ritual David had started when Tommy was younger, and that had been lost when David disappeared. Margaret found herself watching them together, watching Tommy laugh at something David said, watching David's face light up with joy at his son's engagement. She allowed herself to hope. She allowed herself to imagine a future where this nightmare could somehow be redeemed, where the missing years could somehow be transformed into a story of survival and reunion rather than abandonment. The DNA results were scheduled to come in on a Friday afternoon. David suggested they go to the lab together, all 3 of them, to get the results. They arrived at the lab at 3 p.m. on a cold February day. The technician, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, asked them to follow her to a private office. "I want to be clear about what these results mean," Patricia said carefully, and something in her tone made Margaret's stomach clench. "We've run the test 3 times to make sure there were no errors. We've compared the DNA samples with the reference DNA you provided." "And?" David asked, his voice suddenly small. Patricia looked at the papers in front of her. "The results show that this individual," she pointed to David, "is not biologically related to either Margaret or Tommy Hollis. In fact, the results show that he shares DNA with Vincent Hollis, Margaret's brother-in-law. Based on the genetic markers, this individual is most likely Vincent's biological child, perhaps a son or a close relative." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret couldn't quite process what she was hearing. She looked at David, at the man she'd believed was David, and watched his face crumble. I don't understand," David whispered. Patricia continued, her voice clinical and professional. "The biological David Hollis does not match any of the DNA profiles we have on file. This individual, however, matches Vincent Hollis's DNA profile at a level that indicates close biological relation. If I had to make an educated guess, I'd say this is Vincent's son." The silence that followed was absolute and complete. Margaret felt as though she'd been pulled underwater, the pressure crushing, the air impossible to find. This man, this stranger who'd lived with her, who she'd embraced at the airport, who'd shared dinner with her, who'd been rebuilding a relationship with her son, was a complete stranger. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, but there was something in his voice now, a different tone, a different cadence. "I know I'm David. I remember everything. I know things only David would know." "Did you?" Patricia asked, and there was sympathy in her voice now. "Or did you know things about David Hollis that you'd researched, perhaps things shared by Vincent?" The man stood up suddenly, his chair scraping back loudly. "I need to leave," he said, not looking at Margaret or Tommy. "Wait," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "Who are you? Who are you, really?" The man stopped at the door and turned back to look at them. In his eyes, Margaret could suddenly see Vincent, the same shape to his face, the same expression of charming dishonesty that Vincent had worn so well. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry." And then he was gone, walking out of the lab, disappearing from their lives as completely as David had disappeared 12 years earlier. Part 5. The police investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. The man had indeed been Vincent's biological son. His name was Marcus Hollis, born to a woman in Seattle in 1971, a woman Vincent had been involved with briefly before abandoning her. Marcus had grown up without a father, raised by his mother in poverty, shuffled through foster care after his mother died when he was 14. Marcus had been homeless for most of his adult life. He'd spent time in shelters, on the streets, moving from city to city with no fixed address and no permanent connections to anyone. Then, last year, he'd seen an obituary in the Denver Post for Vincent Hollis, noting that Vincent had died in a car accident in Reno. Something in Marcus had broken at that moment, some final chord connecting him to the idea that he might have a father somewhere, that there was some biological connection that meant something. He'd researched the Hollis family online. He'd found the missing persons report for David Hollis. He'd found Margaret's name, had Googled her, and found her address through public records. And in a moment of desperate inspiration, he'd decided to become David. He'd memorized details from the missing persons report. He'd invented dialogue that seemed authentic. He'd studied photographs online, learning David's mannerisms from family pictures. He'd researched architecture so he could discuss David's profession knowledgeably. He'd lived so much in his imagination, constructing a false identity so carefully that he'd eventually half believed it himself. When the police arrested him, he broke down completely. He admitted everything. The entire elaborate con, the false memories, the stolen biographical information. He cried as he explained that he just wanted to belong to a family, that he'd been alone his entire life, that he'd seen an opportunity to be someone's son and couldn't resist it. The district attorney charged him with fraud, identity theft, and filing false documents. He pleaded guilty to everything. The trial lasted 3 days. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months, taking into account his difficult childhood and his genuine remorse. Margaret attended the trial, sitting in the gallery each day, watching this strange ghost of her brother-in-law's son, trying to reconcile the man she'd believed in with the desperate, broken person sitting in the defendant's chair. Tommy didn't attend. He'd refused, unable to face the man who'd betrayed them. Instead, he'd thrown himself into his engineering coursework, using work as a way to avoid processing his emotions. Margaret recognized the pattern. It was the same thing she'd done after David disappeared, burying herself in motherhood and the logistics of survival. On the final day of the trial, before sentencing, the judge gave Marcus an opportunity to speak. He stood up, thin and hollow-eyed after months in the county jail waiting for trial, and looked directly at Margaret. "I don't expect forgiveness," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I don't deserve it. I lied to you about the most important thing. I lied about who I was. I took advantage of your grief and your hope, but I want you to know that the part of me that wanted to be part of your family, that wanted to know you and Tommy, that part was real. I didn't understand it at the time, but I think I was looking for redemption, looking for a way to be more than what I've been. You gave me that for a few weeks, and I destroyed it with my lies." Margaret left the courtroom without responding. She couldn't. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't cause her more pain. She walked out into the Portland rain and let it fall on her face, let it soak through her clothes, let it wash away the tears she couldn't cry. Part 6. 2 years after Marcus's arrest, Margaret and Tommy had painstakingly rebuilt their lives, but this time with a different kind of awareness. They'd learned that hope could be dangerous, that the human need to believe could be weaponized against you, that sometimes the most painful wounds were those inflicted by people you'd allowed into your heart. Margaret had finally filed for divorce from David. There was no point in remaining legally married to a man who'd been gone for 14 years, who'd abandoned her out of fear, who'd let her spend the prime years of her life in suspended animation, waiting for him. The judge granted the divorce with little fanfare. David Hollis, the real David Hollis, remained legally dead in all ways that mattered. She'd started a support group for families of missing persons. She facilitated meetings in a community center in downtown Portland, where people came to share their stories, their fears, their desperate hopes for closure. She discovered that her own pain, when channeled into service to others, became bearable. She discovered that bearing witness to other people's grief somehow made her own grief feel less isolating. Tommy had graduated from the University of Oregon with honors. He'd found an internship at a prestigious engineering firm, the kind of place where his father had once worked. He'd also started seeing Lauren, the girl from his physics class, and they'd been together for almost a year. He was beginning to build a life, to move forward, to stop looking backward. On a Tuesday evening in November, 13 years after David first disappeared, Margaret received a phone call from the Portland Police Department. An officer named Detective Chen explained that they'd had a discovery. A skeleton had been found in a ravine outside Salem during a hiking expedition. The bones had been there for a very long time. DNA analysis had identified the remains as belonging to David Hollis. The details emerged over the following weeks. David's body had been found in a ravine approximately 40 miles south of Portland, apparently having fallen or been thrown from a nearby cliff sometime in 1989. The coroner's office determined that he'd likely died from the fall or from injuries sustained in the fall. There were no indications of foul play, though the skeleton had been exposed to the elements for so long that many details were impossible to determine. The police reopened their investigation into his disappearance. They questioned Vincent, but Vincent had already been dead for over a decade. They questioned his brother's ex-wife, who didn't remember anything significant. They concluded that the most likely scenario was that David had encountered Vincent in the parking lot that they'd argued, and that Vincent, desperate and dangerous, had killed David in a moment of rage, then dumped the body in the ravine to hide his crime. Margaret learned that she'd been married to a corpse for 13 years. She learned that her husband had been lying in a ravine for all those long years while she waited at home, while she attended support group meetings for missing persons, while she held on to hope. The injustice of it was almost too much to bear, but there was something else, something that came with the identification of David's remains. Closure. For 13 years, Margaret had existed in a state of terrible uncertainty. Now, she knew. David hadn't left her. David hadn't abandoned their son out of fear. David had been killed, probably within hours of that Tuesday night when he walked out to get milk. Margaret attended a small memorial service at a funeral home in Portland. Tommy was there, his arm around Lauren. Margaret's parents came, aged now and fragile, still grieving a son-in-law they'd never fully understood. The priest who conducted the service spoke about hope and closure, about the peace that comes from knowing. But Margaret didn't feel peaceful. She felt angry. She felt as though the past 13 years had been stolen from her, By Vincent, by circumstances, by David's own fatal decision to be a good person and tell his brother to turn himself in. 3 days later, Margaret sat alone in her living room with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. On the television, a true crime documentary was playing, one she'd started watching and then abandoned. On her lap was a folder containing copies of David's autopsy report, his dental records confirmation, his DNA analysis results. She thought about Marcus, the man who'd pretended to be David, who was now serving his sentence in a prison facility in Oregon. She thought about how, in some twisted way, Marcus had given her a gift, the opportunity to believe that David had survived, that David had chosen to come back, that there was some possibility of redemption. For a few weeks, Margaret had allowed herself to hope that the narrative of her life could be rewritten into something less tragic. The reality was far worse. David had been dead all along. He'd never abandoned her or Tommy by choice. He'd been taken by his brother, the man Margaret had always known was dangerous, the man she should have warned David about more forcefully, the man she'd written off as bad, but not evil. And now David's remains would be cremated, and Margaret would scatter his ashes in the Willamette River, where he should have been scattered 13 years ago. She would attend a graveside service. She would accept condolences from people who didn't understand that being killed 13 years ago is somehow different than being killed yesterday, but not as different as you might think. The wound is still fresh. The body still grieves. The heart still refuses to accept what the mind knows to be true. Tommy called that evening. "How are you holding up?" he asked, and there was such tenderness in his voice that Margaret nearly broke apart. "I'm still here," she said, which was all she could manage. "That's enough," Tommy said. "That's all any of us can do." After hanging up, Margaret looked at the photographs on her mantel, David on their wedding day, David holding newborn Tommy, David laughing at something someone said at a Christmas party. She looked at these frozen moments of a man who'd been taken from her without warning, without goodbye, without the chance to say the things that needed saying. The official conclusion was that Vincent Hollis had killed his brother in a moment of rage and desperation, then dumped his body in a ravine. Case closed. Murderer deceased. No justice to be served, no trial to be had, no confrontation possible. Margaret learned that sometimes the answers you finally get don't satisfy you, don't heal you, don't make the years of waiting feel anything less than wasted. She learned that closure is an abstract concept that doesn't actually exist. There is only the continuation of life in a different form, with different scars, with different ways of carrying the weight. But she also learned that the act of seeking answers, of pushing for truth, of refusing to accept easy lies, that these acts have value, even if the truth they uncover is devastating. She learned that bearing witness to her own pain and to the pain of others gave that pain some meaning. And on quiet evenings, sitting in the same living room where she'd once believed her dead husband had returned as a ghost, Margaret Hollis poured herself tea, and she remembered.